It was a shattering blow to the peace of their quiet town when fake HOA enforcers tragically ran over Mark Corbin's 6-year-old daughter. Unbelievably led by a disgraced ex-SEAL named Rick Vance, these imposters terrorized families under the guise of false authority. But Mark, a veteran and a devoted father, wasn't about to stand by. He devised a plan that would turn their reign of fear completely upside down, and you won't believe how this intense battle for justice ended, with a powerful twist proving some lines should never be crossed. In the quiet, tree-lined suburban streets of Lakeview, life typically moved at a pace that felt almost untouched by the chaos of the world beyond. Kids played hopscotch on the sidewalks, neighbors waved casually from their porches, and weekends meant backyard barbecues and slow, easy mornings. It was precisely the kind of neighborhood where people occasionally left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Safety was simply never a question. Until that day, Mark Corbin, a retired Navy SEAL with salt and pepper hair and a gaze that had once scanned foreign battlefields, had finally come home for good. After years of deployments and heartbreakingly missed birthdays, he was determined to rebuild the life he'd put on pause. His greatest joy now was watching his 6-year-old daughter Lily, who had just triumphantly learned to ride her first real bike, a bright pink one with sparkly tassels fluttering from the handlebars, a birthday present she hadn't stopped talking about. That afternoon, the golden sun painted the streets of Lakeview in warm, inviting hues. Mark stood at the kitchen window, a steaming mug of coffee, warming his hands, watching Lily wobble and laugh as she pedaled determinedly up and down the driveway. Her helmet, slightly too big, kept sliding down over her brow every few seconds, but her determination was truly endless. Every shaky turn of the wheels brought a rare, peaceful smile to Mark's face, the kind that only emerges after knowing what real fear feels like. Inside the house smelled comfortingly of fresh-baked cookies, and the television murmured softly in the background, reporting some distant story that felt worlds away from their little haven. For the first time in what felt like years, Mark allowed himself to breathe, truly breathe. But then, without warning, the air split open. It wasn't just a noise. It was a sound that ripped violently through the calm, rattling the windows and setting every single one of Mark's instincts on high alert. Somewhere nearby, tires screeched against pavement, and a dog barked frantically. Mark's coffee mug crashed to the floor, forgotten as he sprinted instinctively for the front door. Down the street, a menacing black pickup truck roared into view, a battered beast of a vehicle. Its doors were slapped haphazardly with hastily printed HOA enforcement and decals, and red and blue lights were bolted crookedly onto the roof. Two men leaned out of the windows, barking orders through a crackling megaphone, their voices distorted and sharp, slicing through the stunned silence of the neighborhood. Unauthorized parking, immediate compliance, required move off the sidewalks. Shockingly, the truck didn't slow down. It didn't even hesitate. Instead, it veered violently onto the curb, its tires bouncing aggressively over the concrete as if it were nothing. Lily, halfway across the driveway, froze like a deer caught in headlights. Her little legs struggled desperately to push the pedals faster, her bike wobbling precariously under the sudden rush of fear. Mark's heart plummeted into his stomach. He was already moving, sprinting, with burning lungs, shouting her name, but he was agonizingly too far too late. The black truck hurtled forward, and in a horrifying heartbeat, everything shattered. The front bumper clipped the back of Lily's bike, sending it spinning out from under her. Mark saw it all unfold in sickening slow motion, her small body tossed sideways, Her legs sprawled directly into the truck's relentless path. With a sickening crunch, the wheels rolled over her. A brutal, heart-stopping moment that seemed to hang suspended in the air forever. Mark reached her side just as the truck skidded to a sloppy halt several yards ahead, its engine rumbling like an animal ready to lunge again. Lily's small frame lay crumpled on the ground, her beloved bike twisted into an unrecognizable shape beside her. Her helmet had flown off, landing uselessly in the grass, and her tiny legs, the same ones that had been kicking with pure joy just minutes earlier, now lay motionless, unnaturally twisted in ways no body should ever bend. Mark dropped to his knees, gathering her trembling body into his arms. His vision blurred with a fury and terror so fierce it felt like the world had tilted violently off its axis. Behind him, incredibly, the fake HOA enforcers shouted more orders, their megaphones still blaring, as if they hadn't just broken a child's body and shattered a family's world. And in that devastating moment, as Mark pressed his hand against his daughter's chest, desperately feeling for her heartbeat, something inside him, something forged on battlefields oceans away, reawakened with chilling intensity. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Shock rippled through the quiet streets of Lakeview like an unexpected earthquake. No one had seen this coming. Neighbors who had been watering their lawns or chatting amiably on porches stood frozen garden hoses dropping from limp fingers, words dying in their throats. Someone let out a high, raw scream. Someone else collapsed to their knees on the sidewalk, hands clutching their head in disbelief. Time itself seemed to stutter. At the center of it all lay Lily, her small body, terrifyingly still, sprawled across the cracked pavement. Her legs, the same legs that had been energetically pedaling her pink bicycle just moments before, were now bent at angles that defied nature. Disturbingly, the black pickup didn't stop immediately. Instead, it lumbered forward another 20 yards, seemingly indifferent to the devastation left in its wake. Only then did it screech to a heavy, reluctant halt, its tires grinding harshly against the road. The engine coughed and rumbled, a menacing sound that gnawed at the stunned silence. Two men leaped out of the truck, moving not with the urgency of rescuers, but with the cold aggression of men on a mission. Both wore mismatched uniforms, tactical vests thrown carelessly over plain clothes, cheap badges pinned crookedly to their chests. In their hands, they carried firearms held high, like declarations of an authority they hadn't earned. One barked menacingly into a battered megaphone, his voice cracking through the stunned crowd. "Everyone inside now! Public disturbance violation!" The words were absurd, completely out of place, an insult layered thickly over horror. Mark knelt beside Lily, cradling her broken body with trembling hands. He could barely process the surreal scene unfolding around him, the shouts, the weapons, the neighbors stumbling backward, the unbelievable sight of these fake enforcers treating a child's profound suffering as little more than an inconvenience. His heart thundered against his ribs, each beat screaming a demand for action. But his hands, the same hands once trained for silent, deadly missions across enemy lines, now trembled helplessly. There were no battle plans here, no clear objectives, only the agonizing truth that he couldn't rewind the last 60 seconds, couldn't shield his daughter from what had already been done. The fake officers pushed forward aggressively, shoving their way past stunned residents who dared to linger too long. Their faces were cold, almost mechanical, as they corralled mothers, fathers, teenagers, anyone who bore witness to their cruelty, back into their homes. There was no compassion, no hesitation, only a desperate need to maintain control over a situation spiraling far beyond their grasp. Mark barely noticed them anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the precious child in his arms. He brushed a trembling hand across Lily's forehead, whispering her name over and over as if the sound alone could pull her back to him. Tears blurred his vision, but they didn't fall. Instead, a deeper force took root inside him. Something darker, heavier. It wasn't just sorrow. It wasn't fear. It was rage. Pure, searing rage. A fire lit in the depths of his chest, a familiar burn he hadn't felt since the fiercest battles overseas, except this time the enemy wasn't a distant threat, hidden behind concrete walls or desert sands. This enemy had faces, had names, and they were right here, barking orders and waving weapons over his broken child. Mark's muscles coiled like springs, every instinct honed from years of survival, screaming for release. But logic, that stubborn fragment of training, held him back, for now. This wasn't a battlefield where brute force would solve everything. This was his home. His daughter needed him steady still. Yet one truth seared itself into Mark's mind with crystal clarity. This would not be forgotten. It would not be forgiven. And it would not go unanswered. As the fake officers moved further down the block, yelling at more stunned families, Mark gathered Lily closer, shielding her from their sight. He knew deep down that the system they were supposed to trust might fail them, that justice, if left to its own devices, might never truly come. But Mark Corbin had not survived countless battlefields only to bow his head now. A storm was building inside him, a storm that would not rest until the men who did this paid for every single inch of pain they had caused. This was no longer just about what happened to Lily. It was about every neighbor, silenced, every child terrified, every ounce of peace stolen by cowards hiding behind fake authority. And Mark Corbin, he wasn't about to let that stand. Finally, the wail of sirens cut through the heavy stillness of the neighborhood, arriving not like a savior, but more like a grim reminder of how long 8 minutes could truly feel. 8 minutes, an eternity when your child lay broken on the asphalt. By the time the patrol car rolled lazily onto the street, Mark had already done what his instincts demanded. He had taken photographs of everything, the fake badges, poorly pinned to the vests, the battered black pickup, with its license plates barely clinging on, and, most importantly, the faces. The smirking, careless faces of the men who had turned his daughter's laughter into screams. He had gathered every shred of evidence he could, his hands steady despite the earthquake raging inside his chest. If the law was coming, he desperately wanted to believe it would deliver justice. He wanted to believe it still meant something. The cruiser door creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt, with a casualness that immediately scraped across Mark's raw nerves. There was no urgency, no rush to check on the injured child, just a bored flick of his sunglasses up onto his forehead as he sauntered over. Mark rose to meet him, his body coiled tight, every inch of him screaming for action. He thrust the phone forward, displaying the damning photos. These men, they're not real enforcement. They ran over my daughter. She's critical. You need to arrest them now. Unbelievably, the officer barely glanced at the screen. He gave a half-hearted shrug, as if Mark had just complained about a noise violation or an overgrown hedge. Sounds like an HOA dispute, the officer said, his voice flat. Out of our hands, civil matter. You'll have to take it up with the association or the courts. Mark stared at him, the words hitting harder than any physical blow. Civil matter. Lily was fighting for her life, and they were calling it a paperwork problem. His hands curled into fists so tight that the skin across his knuckles turned ghostly white. A muscle twitched uncontrollably along his jaw. He could feel the rage rising, a tidal wave, pressing against the last fragile barriers of his discipline. But he said nothing. Not yet. Not here. Because in that precise moment, as he watched the officer casually turn away, the bitter truth crystallized with brutal clarity: no one was coming to help them. No badge, no system, no promise of justice was strong enough to stand against laziness, bureaucracy, and sheer cowardice. Mark was utterly on his own. Behind him, the paramedics carefully loaded Lily into the back of the ambulance. The flashing red lights painted her pale face in harsh, flickering shades, her small body almost swallowed by the large straps and medical equipment. One of the EMTs caught Mark's eye as they closed the doors. A tight nod, grim and professional. It conveyed what words couldn't: she was alive, but barely. The ambulance peeled away, sirens howling once more as it raced toward Lakeview General Hospital. Mark stood in the street long after it disappeared from view, the sharp taste of metal on his tongue, the roar of his own heartbeat drowning out everything else. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring down the empty road as a solemn vow stitched itself into the very fibers of his soul. He would find them, he would make them answer, and he would stop them no matter the cost. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even strictly about justice, at least not the kind you could file a complaint for and wait patiently to receive. This was something older, something deeper, a father's oath, carved in pain and tempered in fury. The fake officers had stolen the one thing Mark Corbin had sworn to protect above all else. Now they had something of his, and he would not rest until he took everything back. By sunrise, Mark Corbin was no longer the helpless father standing frozen in the street. He was a man with a mission, and missions were something Mark understood better than almost anything else. The first step was simple: find the truth, because truth, when wielded correctly, was a weapon more powerful than any bullet. In the pre-dawn stillness, while the town of Lakeview still clung desperately to the illusion of peace, Mark made the calls he had sworn he would never need again. One went to Dave Chen, a former CIA analyst with a memory like a steel trap and an uncanny knack for digging into places others wouldn't dare touch. Another went to Sarah Tech Miller, a genius with databases and encrypted records, once the quiet shadow behind countless classified operations. They didn't ask many questions. Old bonds ran deeper than blood. When Mark said he needed information, they simply answered. Within hours, the pieces began to fall into place, and the picture they formed was even uglier than Mark had imagined. There was no official HOA enforcement agency operating in Lakeview, no sanctioned patrols, no legal authority whatsoever behind the men who had paraded around the neighborhood like petty tyrants. Instead, Dave's search uncovered a crude but chilling reality. The so-called officers were a patchwork gang stitched together from disgraced former residents, men and women who had defaulted on HOA dues, lost bitter property disputes, or simply been kicked out for causing trouble. Rather than disappear quietly, they had banded together in anger and greed, creating a rogue force under the flimsiest veil of authority. They wore second-hand tactical vests, used imitation badges bought online, and slapped cheap magnetic decals onto whatever battered trucks they could find. Their business model was brutally simple: intimidation. They issued fake citations for entirely made-up violations: grass, two long wrong trash bins parking at the wrong angle, and demanded immediate fines under threat of more aggressive consequences. If residents protested, they ramped up the fear tactics, threats, harassment, even minor acts of property vandalism to encourage compliance. All the while, sickeningly, the real HOA board, apparently paralyzed by fear of scandal and potential lawsuits, turned a blind eye. As long as the neighborhood appeared orderly from the outside, no one dared stir the pot. But now, with Lily lying critically injured in a hospital bed, the lie could no longer be ignored. Tex sent Mark a series of grainy photos pulled from neighborhood security cameras and old HOA meeting records. Faces emerged. Rough, angry, bitter faces. Men who had found a way to turn their personal grievances into power over others. Men who had let that power warp them into something monstrous. Mark's eyes locked onto one particular photo, and for a moment, everything else faded. Rick Vance. The name hit him like a fist to the chest. Rick had been his brother-in-arms, once another SEAL, another man who had sworn the same sacred oaths. They had trained together, bled together. Mark had trusted Rick to watch his back in places where mistakes meant certain death. And now Rick was here in Lakeview, hiding behind a stolen title, terrorizing innocent families, running down children without a second thought. The betrayal twisted something deep inside Mark's gut. It wasn't just the horrific crime that burned. It was the fall, the sickening knowledge that a man who once stood for honor and brotherhood had sunk so tragically low. Mark stared intently at Rick's face, memorizing every hard line, every cruel smirk. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some misunderstanding. Rick Vance had made a conscious choice. And now Mark would make his own. No court summons, no polite cease and desist letters. There were lines you simply didn't cross. Rick had sprinted past them. Mark sat back in his chair, the first light of morning casting long shadows across the floor. His hands were steady now, his mind crystal clear. He didn't know yet exactly how it would end, only that it would end. Because some debts demanded to be paid in full. Mark Corbin didn't call the police again. He didn't file another report or schedule a meeting with a lawyer. Some battles couldn't be won with paperwork. Some battles had to be faced head-on. He dressed simply that morning: jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a weathered baseball cap pulled low over his brow. No insignias, no medals, just a man stripped down to what mattered most. He slid into his old pickup truck, a quiet beast compared to the chaos roaring inside his chest, and drove out before the sun had fully burned away the mist clinging stubbornly to the fields. It didn't take long to find them. The abandoned supermarket on the edge of town had long since been forgotten, its windows boarded up, its parking lot cracked and sprouting weeds. The perfect place for men who wanted to act like kings without prying eyes. And there it was, the black pickup, its crooked decals now barely visible under a fresh coat of dust and grime, parked as arrogantly as ever, like a trophy on display. Mark pulled his truck in close, the tires crunching loudly over broken glass and gravel. He cut the engine, the silence settling like a heavy blanket. Then, without hurry, he stepped out. In his right hand, he carried a baseball bat, old, scuffed, well-worn, but solid as iron. He let it hang loosely at his side, the very picture of calm purpose. Across the lot, 3 men lounged on the hood of the black truck, passing a soda can, back and forth laughing at some private joke. Rick Vance sat in the middle, his boots propped arrogantly on the bumper, the same smirk on his face that Mark remembered from years past, only now it was colder demeanor. They saw Mark too late. Rick straightened up, a lazy grin spreading across his face. "Well, well," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who decided to crawl out from behind his white picket fence. What's the matter, Corbin? Come to file a complaint?" Mark said nothing. Words were useless here. He walked forward steadily, each step measured the bat swinging lightly with a rhythm that mirrored his own heartbeat. Rick pushed himself off the truck, squaring his shoulders. The two others flanked him, looking uncertain, but trying desperately to appear tough. Mark didn't slow down. When he was close enough to smell the stale sweat and cheap cologne, he moved, one smooth, practiced motion, the kind of motion muscle memory made second nature. The bat came up in a clean, swift arc. The first blow struck the hood of the pickup dead center. Metal crumpled with a hollow crunch. The second swing shattered a headlight shards of glass, exploding outward in a rain of glittering debris. The third strike punctured a tire. The rubber sighed audibly as the truck sank onto its rims. Rick flinched backward, the bravado draining rapidly from his face, like water from a punctured canteen. Hey man, easy," one of his buddies barked, raising his hands defensively. But it was far too late for easy. Rick lunged fists, swinging wild and fast. But Mark had danced this dance before, under far worse conditions, against enemies far more dangerous. He easily ducked the clumsy punch and drove his fist straight into Rick's nose with surgical precision. A sharp, snapping impact. Not reckless, but controlled, deliberate. Rick staggered backward, hands flying to his face as he gasped in shock and pain. Mark stood his ground, the bat still hanging loosely in one hand, as calm as a gathering storm. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't flailing. He was exact cold, determined. In that moment, he was no longer just a father seeking justice. He was the embodiment of every broken oath, every betrayed trust, every innocent life crushed under the wheels of cowardice. Rick dropped to his knees, a trickle of blood running over his upper lip. The other two men froze their courage, evaporating entirely under the sheer weight of the silence between them. Mark's voice, when it finally came, was low and steady. "You picked the wrong town. You picked the wrong family." He didn't need to say more. The message was crystal clear. Final. The bat swung down once more, not at the men, but at the truck. Another crumpling crash echoed across the empty lot, a warning written decisively in twisted steel. And then Mark turned and walked away, leaving the wreckage behind him, his steps sure and unwavering. He wasn't finished, not yet. This was only the beginning. Predictably, they tried to fight back verbally. Words spilled from their mouths, threats about lawsuits, accusations that Mark was assaulting officers, desperate cries to reclaim some shred of the authority they never truly had. But Mark Corbin, seasoned by years of real battles, knew exactly how to end a confrontation fast. 15 seconds. That was all it took. 2 precise moves, 2 more bodies crumpled on the cracked asphalt, groaning and clutching at bruised ribs and shattered pride. Rick lay sprawled nearest, gasping through a bloodied nose, too stunned to even curse. Mark stood over them, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. "You wanted to play cop," he growled, his voice like gravel dragged across stone. "Fine, let's play, but by my rules now." Calmly, efficiently, he stripped Rick's belt and used it to bind the man's wrists tightly behind his back. The second and third followed quickly, wrists cinched tight, faces pressed humiliatingly to the dirty ground. Mark then snapped a few pictures, not out of cruelty, but out of strategy. A message, a warning, anonymous, straight to the local news. The photos spread through Lakeview like wildfire. By noon, they were everywhere, buzzing on local social media pages, flashing across news bulletins, even pinned physically on neighborhood bulletin boards. The images were impossible to ignore. 3 men, hog-tied and humiliated, sprawled on the cracked asphalt beside their battered truck. More importantly, They showed the undeniable truth: the so-called enforcers were nothing but imposters playing dress-up with real lives on the line. Reporters, sensing the scent of something much bigger than a simple neighborhood scuffle, began to dig deeper. What they uncovered shocked even the most jaded residents. Dozens of testimonies came pouring in. Stories of fake citations handed out like candy, threats of escalating fines if families didn't pay cash on the spot. Vandalized property, families, even ones with small children, harassed late into the night with threats of eviction from homes they legally owned. And behind it all, the same faces, Rick Vance and his crew, faces now plastered across every screen in town. Under the mounting, undeniable pressure, the real police could no longer sit idle. Whatever informal arrangements or blind eyes might have existed before, they crumbled instantly under the sheer weight of public outrage. The system had been forcefully woken up. Less than 24 hours after the photos surfaced, all three men were arrested. The charges were swift and serious: criminal impersonation, assault, coercion, conspiracy, and most devastatingly of all, endangerment of a child. Lakeview's courthouse, usually sleepy and forgotten, buzzed with reporters and concerned locals eager to see justice finally unfold. The handcuffs clicked closed around Rick's wrists without ceremony. There were no last-minute speeches, no grand protests, just the cold, hard efficiency of the law finally catching up. And through it all, Mark Corbin stayed silent. He didn't attend the arrest. He didn't need to. He had already done his part. A few days later, as he visited Lily in her hospital room, something happened that struck deeper than any headline or victory march could. Lily lay propped up by a mountain of pillows, her tiny legs encased in heavy white casts. Stuffed animals lined the windowsill, get well cards taped haphazardly to the walls. Machines beeped softly in the background, a constant mechanical reminder of the long road ahead. But when Mark walked in, she lit up, her whole face transforming, breaking into a radiant, gap-toothed smile that momentarily pushed aside the pain and fear still shadowing the room. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered, her voice small but sure. Mark crossed the room in 2 strides, sinking carefully onto the edge of her bed. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and smiled back, a real smile, full of warmth and immense pride. She didn't ask about what had happened. She didn't need to. Because somehow, even at 6 years old, she knew. She knew her father had kept his promise that he would always protect her, no matter the cost. And in that powerful moment, looking into his daughter's shining eyes, Mark Corbin knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just fought for Lily's safety. He had fought for the very soul of their home. And he had won. In the courthouse, the walls seemed to hum with tension as the trial unfolded. Rick Vance sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his once arrogant posture diminished to a slumped, hollow shell. Beside him, his 2 accomplices stared blankly at the floor, their bravado having long since evaporated. When it came time for Rick to speak, he clung desperately to the only defense he could muster. He claimed he had only been trying to maintain order, that his actions were misunderstood, that he had never intended for anyone to get hurt. But mere words were powerless against the mountain of concrete evidence stacked against him. Security camera footage from nearby homes showed everything: the reckless driving, the fake uniforms, the aggressive confrontations. Photographs captured the falsified tickets, the damaged properties, and the battered faces of the men after Mark had confronted them. Neighbors lined up to testify, one after another, painting a damning picture of fear, harassment, and utter lawlessness. And then there were the medical reports. Lily's injuries spoke louder and more profoundly than anything Rick could possibly say. 2 broken legs, torn ligament scars that would take years to fade, if ever. The courtroom was utterly silent as the judge delivered the verdict. There was no dramatic outburst, no last-minute confession, just the firm, measured tone of justice finally irrevocably catching up. Rick Vance was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. His accomplices received 10 years each. There would be no easy way out, no backroom deals, no second chances. As the gavel fell, Mark sat quietly in the back row, his hands folded, his expression calm. He didn't smile. This wasn't a victory to celebrate, it was simply a necessary end. Days later, when Lily was finally discharged from the hospital, the sun was shining brightly against the rooftops of Lakeview, as if the town itself was trying to heal. Mark carried her carefully down the steps, her small frame surprisingly light against his strength. The pink casts on her legs were heavy, but her spirit was anything but. She clutched a stuffed bear tightly in one arm and grinned up at him, a silent thank you shining brightly in her eyes. They made their way slowly toward the truck, every step a small triumph. And as Mark helped Lily into her seat, securing the belts gently around her, he realized something profound. Sometimes the wars you fight aren't on distant shores against enemies with foreign flags. Sometimes they find you right at home on quiet streets, hiding behind familiar faces. But the fight fundamentally was the same, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, standing resolutely between darkness and the ones you love. As he closed the door and circled around to the driver's side, a deep sense of peace settled over him. Not relief, not revenge, just peace. He had done what he promised. He had defended his daughter, his home, and everything he believed in. And in doing so, he had reminded an entire town that real courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it just looks like a father standing tall when the world tries to push him down. Mark started the engine, the hum of it steady and strong beneath his hands. Lily giggled softly beside him, tapping the bear's nose playfully against the window. As they pulled out of the hospital parking lot and turned toward home, Mark glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Not to look for danger, but to consciously leave behind the shadows that had tried and failed to break them. The future stretched out ahead, wide and open, a road waiting to be traveled. And this time, they would travel it together, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. This story serves as a stark reminder that threats don't always come from afar. Sometimes danger can disguise itself in mundane authority, exploiting trust and complacency within our own communities. It highlights the potential fragility of the systems we rely on and underscores the immense strength found in vigilance, courage, and the unwavering determination to protect what matters most, our families and our homes. While taking the law into one's own hands carries significant risks, Mark's story shows the powerful impact one individual can have when fighting for justice against overwhelming odds, reminding us all to stay aware, support our neighbors, and never underestimate the power of standing up against wrongdoing, especially when the vulnerable are targeted. What are your thoughts on Mark's actions? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As Leo dribbled the ball with increasing confidence, Mark saw parents chatting casually on porches, teenagers riding bikes down the street, toddlers chasing bubbles in front yards, just normal everyday life. The kind of precious peace so easily taken for granted had returned to Palm Creek, not by accident, but by conscious choice and collective action. Mark exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the recent months settle somewhere deep inside him, no longer a crushing burden, but a permanent reminder. He knew the world wasn't perfect, It never had been. Danger would always exist. Injustice would always find cracks to slip through. However, he also knew something far more important. Standing up against it, refusing to be cowed, made all the difference. He had seen it in the way the negligent HOA board had crumbled under the pressure of truth. He had seen it in the way neighbors had rallied without hesitation when his family needed them most. And most of all, he saw it every day in the determined smile of his resilient son, who refused to let fear define his future. If the day ever came when he was called upon to fight again, to protect, to defend, to rebuild, Mark would not hesitate. No matter how steep the cost, he would meet that moment head-on, just as he had before. And crucially, he knew he would never stand alone. The people of Palm Creek had proven that. They had stood with him shoulder to shoulder when it mattered most, and Mark knew in his heart they would again if needed. For now, though, he allowed himself the simple privilege of being just a father, watching his son play joyfully in the sunlight, a man standing quiet guard over everything he loved, not with lingering anger, but with unwavering resolve. The battle had been fought. The scars, both visible and unseen, would remain. But so too would the victories, the hard-won, precious victories that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Mark gripped the porch railing, gently feeling the solid wood under his fingertips. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Down on the lawn, Leo let out a shout of triumph as he scored a goal between two makeshift cones, his friends cheering him on. Mark raised a hand in a slow, proud wave. This was what justice looked like. Not just in courtrooms or newspaper headlines, but here in the carefree laughter of a healed boy and the quiet strength of a community that had bravely chosen to be better. Mark stood a little taller. Whatever came next, he was ready. And he knew deep in the steel core of his being that no one would ever again mistake Palm Creek for an easy target. Not while men like him still stood watch, and certainly not while hope burned brighter than fear. This story serves as a powerful reminder that vigilance is not optional but essential for maintaining safety and integrity within our communities. It highlights how easily authority can be faked and misused when oversight is lacking. More importantly, it demonstrates the incredible power of a single individual standing up against injustice and how that courage can galvanize an entire community to demand accountability and enact meaningful change. Never underestimate your voice and never assume someone else is watching out for you. Sometimes you need to be the one to take that first stand. True strength lies not just in individual resilience, but in collective action and the refusal to tolerate negligence or abuse. What are your thoughts on Mark's response and the community's transformation? Let us know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more impactful narratives.